I think that part of why this kind of development hasn't been well understood is because it's pretty complicated,
Yeah.
particularly in the sense of these philosophical orientations.
Mhm.
Because on the face of it, the responses from different orientations can sound very different. But if you really, focus on, well, okay, let's figure this out. What are the actual social relations here?
Mhm.
Are they egoistic? Are they group? Are they larger group? Or are they societal? And
Yeah.
that pretty much can tell you what stage it is.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Metamodern Meaning podcast. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Cheryl Armon. I believe personally that Dr. Armon is one of the great developmental researchers of our time. So I'm really excited to have her here to talk about her work. Dr. Armon's work has focused on moral and evaluative reasoning and the development of those. And we'll be talking about her model a bit in what follows. But she's also worked with some of the great luminaries in the field: Lawrence Kohlberg, Michael Commons, Robert Keegan, Theo Dawson, and also for those who have this now kind of classic work, she was a co-editor on this volume of post-formal studies. And yeah, we're the plan for today is to dig in a little bit to talk about her work on moral reasoning, or specifically, though, evaluative reasoning and the work that she's done with all that and her stage model to discuss. But thank you so much, Dr. Armon. Really appreciate you coming on the podcast.
Glad to be here.
So, let's see. You've had, as I mentioned, a rather illustrious career in the field. I think of you as just one of the big names, one of the researchers to be really one of the most rigorous and impressive longitudinal researchers in this field. And specifically, why I'm really interested in your work is being someone who's interested in meaning, in the development and evolution of meaning-making structures in the human mind. This is really, your bread and butter. You developed originally, I think, as part of your dissertation at Harvard, this evaluative reasoning model, which is sort of like exploring how people think about the good, what is good, what's the good life, what's good work, and charted how that evolves across the lifespan and develops in the mind. And I find that incredibly fascinating. And so I've been really deeply incorporating your work in my own book that I'm writing at the moment called The Evolution of Meaning. And so that's exciting in its own right. And again, most of our conversation I want to spend on that. But why don't you help people get a little bit of sense of you, your work, how you came into the field, your biography, and your kind of career in the developmental studies? Talk a little bit about how you found yourself in developmental research and kind of what that trajectory was in your life.
Okay, so when I was, I don't know, I graduated high school when I was about 16. And at that point, I started traveling, and I already had a pretty good background just in photography. And so I was living in Latin America for a number of years, and my work there focused primarily on how I could represent cinematographically, sort of making documentaries on some of the most indigenous cultures there. And so I made films that were funded by the government, whichever government it was, and are all in Spanish. But it was a chance for me to really, for the first time, explore reasoning from multi directions,
Mm.
and particularly in Latin America, how I could apply philosophies that I had been studying. So before I started traveling, my main interest was moral philosophy. And so I just jumped around from junior college to junior college, and just took the courses I wanted. It
Mm,
was, I wasn't pursuing a degree particularly. And I became, very interested in Immanuel Kant, very interested late that connected then to John Rawls later. And then I was very interested in the really ancient philosophers, such as Aristotle and Spinoza in particular. And I started realizing that they really weren't very well understood.
mm.
At least if you read the original work, which almost nobody does, but I did, just because I was curious. I started to see aspects of those philosophies that not only transcended the popular culture versions of them, but were corrective,
Hmm.
that it was really like off. They were off. And so, but still, my focus was on this filmmaking business. And then when my daughter, who was born in Latin America, was old enough to go to school, I came back to the States and really didn't know what I was going to do. So my mother told me I should, get a BA at least, do something because what I was doing was not something to her. So I just poked around and she told me about this Antioch College branch in Los Angeles. Because my parents, mother and father, had both attended Antioch College, and so had my grandmother in Yellow Springs, Ohio, the main campus.
Mm.
And at that time, the school was very radical and very politically oriented. My parents were too. So it just so happened that I went to this teeny little college, and the person who ran the undergraduate program had been working with Kohlberg for 7 years.
Hmm.
And in fact, the way I got admitted to the school was that he gave me a moral dilemma. And I'm
Huh.
like, wow, this is great. I mean, I love this. Right. And so he gave me this dilemma, and he was so young and everything that I I said, okay, well, this has been fun because he gave me the Korean dilemma. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but that's when you have to figure out who you're going to send in your company of soldiers back to blow up the bridge, and
Hmm.
he's going to die when he does it, but he will therefore save his company.
Hmm.
And so afterwards I said, well, this has really been fun, nice meeting you. So could I speak to somebody, like a real director or something? He said, oh no, I'm the director of this school. You're accepted. Okay, well, that's good. And so just because of him, Al Erdnest, he taught me everything about Kohlberg and about Piaget and about all kinds of stuff like that. And then I started getting interested in connecting moral philosophy that I had been studying for many years to this angle of psychology.
Well,
And
and
then it just turned out that the philosophy instructor at this little school was incredible. He was a specialist in Aristotle. He was a specialist in this and that, but he was also radicalized. So he taught us students, um, that it didn't matter whether you study philosophy or not. You don't have to read these stupid books or just, but you do have to construct your own philosophy of life.
hmm.
And that's what I worked on for like a year and a half.
Hmm.
So it was just freaky. And there's more freak incidents like this I will tell you about.
Well, real quick, you mentioned sort of just, and I'd been reading a lot of moral philosophy. What was it about moral philosophy that you were interested in that excited you? That's not necessarily the standard thing that everyone's just, digesting Kant and Aristotle. What drew you to that literature?
Because I couldn't understand the world with my own whatever I had going for me. I didn't understand what was going on. I mean, I went to school in the inner city. I was beaten. beaten, jumped, as they say. I was pushed ahead. I was promoted so that I was really small and really young. And I just couldn't understand why this was even happening.
Hmm.
My mother's a child psychologist, okay? But even so, she had no idea what I was experiencing. So it was more like a searching for answers that I wasn't getting, certainly from the popular media,
Hmm.
or from my parents, or at least I wanted to go beyond what I was learning from my parents.
Yeah. Interesting. Fascinating. So, okay, yeah. So you're at Antioch then. You're getting taught all about Kohlberg and Piaget and stuff. Yeah. So t take it up from there. How did you go on then to wind up working with Kohlberg and developing your own
Well, what
models?
happened is that as soon as Al Erdnest, remember, who had been student of Kohlberg's and a student of Rawls, because he was at the B school, the business school, um, I wondered, is this true? That was always my question. Like I'm reading, okay, they're saying this, 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 there are stages, there are this or that. And I'm like, is this true? So I said, well, I have to test this out empirically myself.
Hmm.
I don't know why, just because I want to know. And so Al Erdnest helped me put together a study. And oh yeah, I was going to tell you this that I read an article that Piaget had written, a brief article, but at the end it said something like this. Now we know a lot more about how to tell what is true and what is not true. But what's left is the true, after the true, the good and the beautiful.
Hmm.
And so I just took that article over to Al and I said, I want to study this.
Huh. Fascinating.
And that's how it started.
Wow. So like, yeah, in the great kind of Platonic transcendentals, Piaget is like, all right, yeah, now we have a sense of the true here, but that leaves the good and the beautiful. And you're like, all right, well, challenge accepted.
Mhm.
Awesome.
Mhm.
Um, well, yeah, so go on
And
from
I
there.
don't think
Yeah.
you know that when I started the longitudinal work, I was overambitious, which is not surprising. And so I studied not just the good, but the true and the beautiful as well.
Hmm.
So in time one of what became a longitudinal study, I had a whole setup of different pieces of art, for example. And I would say, is this beautiful?
Huh.
And they would say, what did the little kid say? No, it doesn't look like a horse or, whatever. I mean, it was so interesting. You just can't get away from it. Well, I couldn't. So, but eventually I really had to drop the beautiful and the true because Piaget had already really done enough with the true. I felt like I understood it well enough. I didn't need to study anymore. And then it was just too much. I
That
couldn't I couldn't handle
that's
it.
interesting too. I just read this. This is James Mark Baldwin, Genetic
Mhm.
Theory of Reality.
Yeah, I've read that.
And in some ways, I was kind of surprised by it because it wound up being a lot about aesthetics, and I didn't realize that Baldwin really did. I don't know, it's a very
Mhm.
interesting mixture of developmental theories, philosophy, and then like aesthetic philosophy, and almost kind of mysticism. It was fascinating,
But you
but
have to realize that back in the day, like when that book was written, people were not, I would say maybe they're not forced or maybe they're not motivated to lock themselves into a category.
yeah, yeah,
And that's why I loved moral philosophy from the distant past,
yeah,
because they were dealing with everything,
yeah.
not just like one little part.
Yeah, back in Baldwin's day, it was not the same academy as it is now, where you've got to hyper specialize and hyper focus, and then find the gap in the literature and all this thing. It was much more
Mhm.
these big questions, and hopefully will be again. I see signs of that. Well, before getting on to your studies of the good, I am just curious, what became of your studies of the beautiful? Did you find any interesting results from that? Did you ever think about
Of
publishing on it?
course,
Yeah.
it's just as you would imagine that the younger children, uh, I had four groups in my population. And so one was there were 5 to 9 year olds. The next one up is like late adolescence. The next one up is like 20s to 30s. The next one up is 50s. So the little kids, I wish I had it with me, but there's some like there's a Picasso print that I use that just has lines like that maybe 3 or 4 lines, but it's obviously a woman from behind.
Yeah, I've seen that. I've seen that image. Yeah.
Yeah, just 3 lines. Well, the group one saw nothing.
Huh.
They would turn it around, turn it around, turn it around.
Uh-huh.
It's so cute. Well, what is this? It's a bunch of lines. And so to answer your question, I think it's exactly what you would expect. You
Hmm.
know, as you went up the stages, there was more complexity, there was actually a comprehension, and there was also an appreciation of art as opposed to simple representation.
Hmm.
What the younger ones want is a representation. If it doesn't look exactly like the thing it's supposed to be, they don't like it at all.
Hmm. That's fascinating.
That
I
makes perfect sense.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, without anticipating too much some of what we're going to get into, on that front before we move on, do you think then it would be possible to articulate a kind of stage model of the beautiful in terms that also maybe track it meaningfully with like hierarchical complexity in some way?
Definitely.
Wow,
It would be
fascinating.
easy, easy. No, it would be because we know enough now to know where to go. And once you know where to go, you usually find what you're looking for.
Interesting. Well, so talk more about what you did wind up really focusing on and publishing on in terms of the good. I think that sets us up nicely to talk about this work that you've done, longitudinal work. Yeah, set that up however you'd like, and feel free to go into as much detail as you'd like, because this is really the meat and potatoes of this fascinating stuff.
Well, so I'm still in the undergraduate school, right? And I'm running the first group. So I just put up ads all over Cal State LA and UCLA, where I might mention that I did have a position there initially and left. But in any case, I had signs all over, they want to be interviewed, this, that, there's no money involved, and whatever. A lot of people came forward. I was so surprised. Like, as well, I said in my little flyer that I'm interested in what you think about the true, the good, and the beautiful. So,
Hmm.
and spelled it out. I had to turn people away.
Hmm.
And that gave me an insight too, because that meant that people really want to explore their own views in these areas. And many had never done that. So that's how I started the first round. But I have to tell you the story about how I met Kohlberg and
Yes.
ended up going over there.
Yeah.
Okay, so we did that little study and uh, prepared to and did present it at a Piaget conference at USC here in LA. So Kohlberg was the keynote speaker at that event. So he's going to speak, let's say next or something, in an hour or something like that. So I'm in the front row of an auditorium, and there's this really strange man sitting 2 seats away from me, kind of sloppy, and I don't know. So anyway, he's madly writing notes and stuff like that. And he runs out of paper. So he says to me, "Excuse me, but could I have a piece of paper?" Because of course I had a notebook. And I said, okay. And I tore off a corner of the paper and handed it to him. It's unbelievable. I have no idea who he is, right? In fact, I'm sure he couldn't be Lawrence Kohlberg because he looks so ridiculous. And so he cracked up. He was just hysterical. And that's how we met.
Nice.
I didn't know it. He didn't say anything
Uh,
until they announced the keynote speaker, which is him.
mm,
And he stands up. I mean, you can't believe how embarrassed I was. It was funny. But he always used to remember that.
that's really funny. And that would have been what, 1976, 77? I think your first study was in 77, was it?
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, then it would have been 76, maybe.
Uh-huh. Gotcha. So then how did you go from that to wind up working with him
Well,
and
just
working together?
remember that he and Al
Mm,
at Antioch already have a relationship. So after that particular conference, we had dinner together, and he said, "You should just come work." We talk. You
mm.
should just come work with me. Just apply. You'll get in right now.
Wow.
It was-
Yeah. Awesome. Well then so then did that mean that you went over then to Harvard or were you still yeah,
yeah,
cool.
I moved little boyfriend and daughter there.
Gotcha. So then yeah, so then what was the next phase of that like? You were continuing
Well,
your
I
study.
kept my study going,
Yeah.
and then Harvard likes to make money, so what they do is you can't go directly in. Well, I couldn't go directly into the PhD program. I had to go into the master's program first. They have like a cash cow one
Yeah.
year program there. And that's what I was mentioning to you, actually.
Mm.
But anyway, um, and then I just started working very closely with Larry, and yeah,
Yeah. Well, so in the sense of then, yeah, what comes out of that, unless you want to tell more of the story of how this kind of historically unfolded,
no.
I'd be curious to hear more about this model then that came out of this research, which I believe is the product of like a 13-year longitudinal study in which you tracked that
It's
cohort.
longer than that.
Oh, really? How long was it?
I think it's 17 years.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah. So, which is even that was longer than Kohlberg's, wasn't it? He did only 16 years, I think, if I
Yeah.
remember. But yeah, so talk about this model that comes out of this longitudinal study and what the kind of major findings were. We could kind of go through the stages of the different kinds of notions of the good if you want, or however you want to unpack this a bit.
Hmm. Well, it's important to understand that philosophically, the right has always had a very righteous position in philosophy. And so whether you're working with a categorical imperative from Kant, or you're working with Rawls in the original position, it's all the same stuff.
And
Not not to
to be
be,
clear, when you say the right, that you don't mean politically, you mean the right as opposed to the
oh,
good, just so
yeah,
people
yeah,
understand. Yeah, yeah.
yeah. How we determine what is right, what are the principles that philosophy uses to determine what is right, and actually what are the principles or ideas that everyday people have about how they decide what is right. And what is right has always in philosophy, but I think in the world too, taken a much higher presence
Mm,
than what is good.
mm,
But remember, I had already had this background in moral philosophy before.
mhm,
And a lot of what Aristotle talks about is what is good,
mm.
not what is right. And same with Epicurus and all the ancient philosophers. And
How would you tease those apart briefly? You know, how would you say what's the difference between talking about the right versus the good?
well, the thing is, in contemporary society, it's very rigidly defined. What is right is what we are obligated to do. what is good is just personal preference. I mean, that's basically it.
Mm,
So if I say, oh, well, let's talk about what is good sex, well, everybody's going to talk about what they like.
mm,
So, I mean, it's individualistic.
uh-huh,
But in ancient philosophy, that's not true at all.
mhm.
What is good is equally important to what is right. And so I tried to bring those philosophies in only because when people started answering the questions, well, did we talk about the questions?
We haven't talked about them yet.
Okay, so the questions I asked, to say, often focused on the good, because to me, the right has already been worked out. It was worked out 1,000 years ago. What wasn't worked out was how to measure it, or how to empirically collect it or
Mm,
whatever.
mhm.
What is good is still to this day considered by many psychologists, or at least researchers in psychology and philosophy, is relativistic.
Right.
It's just, oh, whatever works or something.
Mhm. And your work is about exploring how actually you can find patterns in the way that people conceive of the good over the lifespan that would seem to, in a sense, challenge simplistic relativistic notions that, of the good. Would you say
Well,
that's a
the way
fair?
I would say it is through the study of philosophy, up through John Rawls, the good has a very central part. It's very important. But in everyday parlance, in a sense, what's right is somehow held up here, and then what's good is like, well, whatever.
Mhm,
And it's just not the case. And that's what I wanted to demonstrate, because I
mhm,
already knew it, because just from reading philosophy, that what is good is I would never say equally important, but is the next step down from the right.
yeah.
And that the people who are clearer about what they actually believe is good are more able to fulfill their lives' dreams.
Mm,
That's something and the reason that doesn't often happen, like when kids graduate from college and they can't figure out what they want to do. Well, that should have been worked out, and they could have figured that out when they were 8 years old, but nobody's helping. No,
yeah. Well, and so what were the questions basically that you were asking in this interview,
So
briefly?
I focused on four aspects. One was, what is the good life in general? And then what is a good friend? What is good work? And what is a good person? So I focused on those four
Mhm.
categories.
And basically, the process was you would ask these questions, people would start to respond, and then you'd kind of ask some follow-up probing questions like, why is that good? And then people would give justifications for their answers. And then you could begin to see some structural aspects and patterns to the way that your sample was answering these questions, something like that.
Yeah, you have to do, excuse me, rather deep questioning, because people are not accustomed to explaining their thinking.
Hmm.
So you have to be pretty patient. So if I ask someone, what is good work, and they start to tell me, sometimes it'll just be like a platitude or something, just a
Yeah.
spontaneous response. But when I ask, well, let's really think this through, I mean, it's different.
Yeah.
And that's when the generalizability of the concept of good became apparent right away. And study one because, so well, let me just say that,
Mm.
my interviews are 5 hours long.
Wow.
So
Well,
you
and
have
is that just the good life interview, or does that also include you? I know you were also doing Kohlberg, a moral judgment interview, and it sounds like you're also doing studies into beauty. So is it the whole thing was a 5 hour long process?
not the whole thing.
Just the good life interview. Oh, wow.
Mhm.
Interesting.
Mhm. And the only thing, I was really worried all the time that people are not going to put up with this shit. It's crazy. But the opposite happens. You could get to the end of a 7-hour interview. I'd say, okay, well, we've completed. No, are we stopping?
I have so
You,
much more
you
to
don't want to
say.
ask me another question? I have more to say
Yeah.
because whoever asked anybody anything
Hmm.
like that. I mean, even marital partners don't ask those things.
Sure. Well, so yeah. So then you're collecting all this data. And again, this is a longitudinal study. So you get you get the sense of the development of this over time in individuals, which I think is something that's really special about your research is a lot of developmental researchers do something called cross-sectional studies. Well, they'll look at a bunch of different people at different ages and they'll try to suggest, well, this suggests development in this direction, but they're not actually doing longitudinal studies, which follow the same people over time to actually empirically see do they actually move in their thinking in a particular direction.
I don't even teach cross-sectional studies.
Mm,
I mean, to me, it doesn't, I'm not saying I think they're invalid, but they don't have enough support to warrant being taught.
hmm. Well, that's actually we kind of bypassed this because we did want to speak a little bit about this and we don't have to go here if you feel like we're kind of already well into the good life stages model. But we you did also some important work publishing on the theory of stage models in general and talking about the differences of hard
Mhm.
stage models, soft stage models. In fact, there's an article in here in this book that you published with Kohlberg on this topic. Maybe just
Let's
briefly,
talk about
yeah,
that
let's talk about that.
because it's really important that hard stage theories right now, there's only what I call three and a half.
Okay.
That's Piaget, Kohlberg, Selman, and then I get the half, Cheryl.
Okay.
So, but then there's soft stage theories. So that's Fowler and others like that. Then there's maturational stage theories. Stage develops as you age.
Hmm.
And then there's lifespan theories like Freud and Erickson.
Hmm.
So there's four types.
Okay.
And I only care about type one. And I only care about stage theories that have been empirically validated. And the only way that can happen is longitudinally.
Yeah. Well, and two quick questions.
It costs too much money and it's too much work. Most people don't do it.
Yeah. Um, quick question. One is when you say Piaget, does that include the later neo-Piagetian like Commons's, the models of hierarchical?
Absolutely not.
Oh, okay. So you would not class those as a hard stage model?
There's no longitudinal work on that
I
model.
see. Gotcha. Gotcha. Okay. Um, interesting. And then the other question is, uh, that yeah, oh yeah, so to actually spell out a little bit what we mean by a hard stage model, what are the criteria for a hard stage model?
Mhm. Okay, so it cannot just carry forward something from the past in a more sophisticated version. It has to be a literal reconfiguration
Hmm.
of the outlook. And then the sequence must be invariant. So no two before one, no three before two, and so forth. How do you find that out? So the lazy people, why I call lazy people, who just did it for their dissertation and then never followed up or whatever. But what they do is just attach it to age. And so they do cross-sectional, but because they're using different ages, then they call it lifespan or
Hmm.
sequential or something. That's wrong.
Hmm.
That just doesn't work. And I did a lot of, once I became a professor and all that, I had a lot of students doing the work of testing these other theories. They don't work.
Hmm.
I mean, how can they're not spelled out? I'm not putting those theories down. It doesn't mean they're not valid,
Hmm.
but they just haven't been supported
Yeah.
appropriately.
Yeah.
And so then the next thing is hierarchical integration. So that means that, simply put, this previous stage is reorganized and reconfigured into the next stage up, and you never go back. Well, maybe in mental illness or some kind of break, I don't know about that, but in general, nobody goes back.
Hmm. Question two. So for
So those are the three
yeah,
criteria
yeah.
for a hard stage model.
Right. So qualitative shift, that's invariant
Invariant
sequence
sequence,
and
hierarchical
hierarchical integration.
integration.
Now, the construct of hierarchical complexity has claimed to meet those criteria, but you would suggest that if it doesn't have a lot of longitudinal data, then it doesn't necessarily kind of count. Or I guess the question there would be like I'm thinking of Theo Dawson's.
It's a propose. I worked on that.
Yeah.
I have a lot of respect for that. It makes sense to me, but it requires longitudinal support
Hmm.
if you want to demonstrate that it's a sequence.
Yeah.
I mean, as opposed to some brilliant kid can do it at 13 or this or that. I mean, there's just a lot of potential alternative interpretations. And
Right.
Michael agrees with that.
Yeah. 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 So then it's not so much a theory thing. I think the theory's agreed on. It's just a matter of meeting a threshold of having enough longitudinal data to prove it, as it were, or
I don't
yeah.
know what you mean by the first thing you said, because a theory is only as good as its empirical support, in my opinion.
Uh-huh. Yeah, what I mean is I think that what you're suggesting for these hard stage criteria is agreed upon by Commons, by Dawson, by people working in hierarchical complexity. That's like a big
Piaget.
it's just a matter of for counting and you're kind of, is it 3.5 how many hard stage models there are. It sounds like you're saying there's got to be a certain threshold of empirical longitudinal data that proves that for a particular
Well,
model.
if you don't have that, then what is it?
Right. Yeah.
It's a fantasy.
Yeah. But arguably, I mean, I think Dawson has a good amount of longitudinal data that suggests the lectical scale would meet that criteria. Would you?
It might. I
Yeah.
haven't really examined it.
Okay. Fascinating stuff. Oh, and one last question on this front. There's debate around, how, in a sense, global these kinds of stages are. You've done work showing a lot of direct correlation between your good life model and Kohlberg's moral judgment model. But what's your sense of like if someone's performing at a certain stage in the good life, is that how much transfer there how much transfer is there into other areas like cognition, maybe like morality? Like, are these domain distinct models, or do you think that there's a deeper construct like hierarchical complexity or something operating that someone who's
I
operating?
would assume
Yeah.
that this would parallel cognitive development,
Hmm.
but there isn't empirical support for that yet. Doesn't mean it's not right,
Hmm.
but it's a good project for you to do, honey. Let's get started.
I'll add it to the list. Yeah, no, for sure.
I want to circle back to your question, which I don't think I fully answered, um, which I understood to mean that you were asking me how universal are these models? How
Yeah,
cross-cultural?
well, not necessarily. I guess what I was asking is, you know, there's a distinction that's been made between sort of domain specific models. So in your case, looking at the good, some people will say Piaget is just looking at cognition. Some people, I mean, Kohlberg himself would say that he was just looking at morality. And then other people will say that, well, these seem to be tapping a deeper core structure in, I think, hierarchical
You
complexity.
mean commons?
Comments, and you actually in your work, in your 1984 contribution about your model, talked at that point about the similarities of seeing at what at the time was called the general stage model for being
Mhm.
able to map to your. So yeah, I'm really interested in the way that some kind of domain general construct could be used to understand where people are at developmentally across these different domains and how much overlap and similarity there might be, because that's always an interesting thing, and I think still kind of an open question, right? Like, could someone maybe, cognitively be operating at a level that's very different from where they would show up if you were to measure where they're at in terms of their assessment of morality or the good. And it seems like there's also been a lot of evidence to suggest that there really is a deeper underlying structure there. That yes, there are, in a sense, different kind of domains that gets expressed through, and there will be varying aspects to how much facility people have in a particular line or a particular area of thought or something, but that there is a kind of like a general, whether you want to call that a center of gravity or a kind of range where people tend to operate from. And I was just wondering what your thoughts were about that.
Okay, well, very specifically, trying to think. I think all the stage models, not counting cognition, have a necessary cognitive structure that supports it.
Hmm.
If you don't have that cognitive structure, you're not going to go there.
Right.
But if you do have that cognitive structure, you won't necessarily go there.
Right.
So that's how it works across many of the
Yeah.
domains. And I think different people and different cultures are better at certain domains than they are at others. And
Mm.
because I mentioned, I traveled a lot, like spending a year in India, and things like that. And what I saw, or what I look back upon when I started my own studies, were the things I saw there, or in Nepal or wherever. But I think what happens is that the cognitive backbone, it's a backbone
Hmm.
of it.
Yeah.
And you have to have that. It's necessary, but not
Yeah.
sufficient.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Right. But
Yeah.
then you have to have experience and thought, cognition exercise in the actual domain.
Right.
And usually you have to have behavior too. It's not just sitting in a corner
Right.
thinking.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. I
I just
that's
want to clarify
Yeah.
that.
And I would like to return to the universality question at the end, maybe once we've had a sense of what the different stages of your good life model are. So yeah, if you're up for it, how about we dive into that and give people a sense of these
Hmm.
stages? Because I think this is really fascinating stuff. And again, I'm integrating your model and your work into a book I'm writing at the moment, and I find a lot of meaningful connections to other models and to other ways that people make meaning, and it's a fascinating thing. So.
Okay, so I'm looking at the Good Life Manual, and I'm starting at, so that's the domain we're talking about now,
Mhm.
good life. Like, what is it? Right? And so at the first stage, which is called egoistic hedonism, you see really explicit concerns about concrete objects and so forth. So I have good examples. So this is a person, probably 6 or 7 years old. What is the good life? There would be green grass, nice houses everywhere, and trees and pretty flowers and nice people. So you get the concreteness of
Mm.
it. So I say, why would nice people be part of the good life? Because they would be nice to you. So cute. What is the bad life? It would be all smoggy and dirty everywhere, and people wouldn't be nice. What would that be like? People would be real mean. So it it's really an idea that the good life is something that serves your personal needs and makes you feel good. Simple enough.
And in a very concrete kind of way, as you were saying,
Yeah,
not
this
very
is really
abstract.
cute. Another response is I say, what is the good life? I'm thinking really hard. I know. Going on the revolution. So the revolution is a roller coaster.
Mm,
Would you do that all the time? No, not all the time. I would like to have my birthday every day. Why would that be good? Because you get presents every day. Do you think you would get tired of getting presents every day? Nope. You might not have any space left in your room for all the presents. That's okay. I could sleep with mom. It's the cutest thing, right? So they got it all worked out. And I think it's important for people who don't know about these things, to see that they're working hard at this.
mm,
Evaluation is not easy,
mm,
and people are rarely asked to do it, and certainly not when they're 5. But this is spontaneous. It's not like the kids are saying, I don't know, well, let me think. No, that right away they know exactly what the good life is for them.
mm.
Okay, let's go on. So, we go to the next stage now?
Sure. Well, maybe a quick summary. So, stage one, egoistic hedonism. It's very concrete and it's very self-focused in terms of meeting immediate needs and having sort of pleasurable experiences. Is that kind of how you'd summarize that? Something like that?
Yes. And there are specific criteria.
Yeah.
Explicit reference to concrete wants is a sole criterion. Reference to simplistic surface features of physical, environmental, or sensory material. Reference to surface attributes as constituting good.
Okay. Yeah. So then, as you said, and that was around 6 or 7, maybe that interview came from, and
5,
5. Yeah. And so then stage two, which you have some examples of, is, if I recall, instrumental hedonism.
that's correct. What is the good life? A good life is being happy, having lots of friends and lots of money. Okay, so how do you see that as differing from stage one?
Well, it's also I'm cheating because I've read your work. So, as the name suggests, there's a notion of sort of means and ends. You kind of use things to meet your needs, and you can
Mhm.
identify that as a distinction. It's
It's
still
not
very,
just some dream or just some fantasy.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's kind of using, still very concrete, but using
Hmm.
things and people to meet your own needs and
Hmm. It's
desires.
not just a roller coaster.
Yeah.
So, so what is a good life? Good life is being happy, having lots of friends and lots of money. Why are those things good? You need friends to do things with, to care for you and to help you if you need help. And it's important to have money and the freedom to do what you want to do. What is the bad life? Having no freedom, no friends, and no money. Makes sense to me. It's not like it's crazy or anything.
Uh, and
In fact,
it's interesting to me too because I hear more abstract ideas coming in here, ideas like freedom and whatnot. There's a sense
mhm.
of it's not just, yeah, more immediate kind of concrete things. It's the sense of having a beginning to have a sense of categories and conceptions
Well, it's the very, very beginning of potential autonomy,
hmm
right? You're not just looking at the roller coaster. It's not just fantasy ideas. They're actual things that people actually like.
Is there an age range that tends to fall in with your data? Do you recall?
Of course, there is. So this would be late childhood and early adolescence,
Hmm.
but there are also adults at
Yeah.
this stage. A significant number of adults are at this stage. Okay, so then we go to stage three, which I call altruistic mutuality. So there's much more focus on personal self having good qualities for the first time. And then there's also a more complicated distinction between affect and experience. So that is feeling good as opposed to doing this good thing. And there's also, for the first time, a focus on relationships.
Mm.
So on other people and the quality of those connections, which you notice in the previous examples, and I have hundreds, there's no such thing. It's just amazing. I mean, there's just no such thing. They're the sort of individuals operating in a vacuum, socially speaking.
Hmm.
I mean, they're not in a vacuum, but
Right.
they don't care. They don't think about the other things.
Yeah, it's largely about thinking about other people in terms of how they can meet your needs rather than intrinsically being,
Even being with them.
yeah. I've certainly known people I've had that experience around.
Right? So, okay, it's some stage three examples. What is the good life? Being happy with yourself, being contented and being with people, the stimulation of having people that you like and care about and enjoy. See, that's way more.
Yeah.
There's so much more inclusivity of other people. Why is that good? That's life to me. Life is people. What is good about being with people? In interaction with people, I learn more about myself and about them. So who cared about learning before?
Mm.
No, we don't
Hmm.
care. And especially social learning.
Hmm.
And this little guy's only 12.
Mm.
So then what is the bad life? Not being able to talk or communicate, not to have that ability or opportunity. Why is that bad? Because that's what I think we're all here for. The bad life for me would be not having those people that I could share with, that I enjoy having around me. So there's plenty of people, adults at this stage.
Hmm.
I would really like to know what the proportion is in the US, but it's going to be different by culture
Hmm.
in terms of proportionality.
Yeah. I mean, I would think this would be based on other correlations with other kinds of models. I would think that this is kind of the majority, um, maybe like something like the modal sense of where
For the
people are
US,
in the US. I think so. In terms of most people are, this is kind of the socialized mind. We're part of society, and we want our friends and we want relationships, and that's all
wait a
deeply.
minute. The minute you use the word society, you've gone beyond this
Well, I'm
area.
not saying people at this stage conceive of that. I'm saying that
Oh,
that they experience being in society and they experience people's society, people's relationships as being a source of meaning to
yeah, if it
them.
weren't for this stage, we wouldn't have the Girl Scouts. We wouldn't have
Right.
clubs. We wouldn't have all these things that people put together, baseball clubs, whatever.
Yeah.
It's group focused. So, but what is the limitation of that? Well, everything here is face to face.
Hmm.
These are face to face relations, not relationships with ideas, not relationship with abstract groups like the Democratic Party or, whatever. Nothing like that. This is like clubs, the knitting group, and
Yeah. Well, and there is an example in your dissertation too, which maybe you have right available. I know someone talks about their religious affiliation. They say, you should be a good person, but also I think they're Jewish, and like I think it's important to be a good Jew. And so this is also, I think, a little bit where that group
group
identity.
identity.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Mhm. Here's another example of the same stage. What is a good life? I'd say the good life is good health, no pressing financial worries, and having someone that loves you and feeling that you have other people to love. Why is that good? Because you need good health to enjoy what there is to enjoy. And I feel it's important to have no stress, which financial worries would bring me. And I think it's very important to have someone that you can love and that can reciprocate that love. Is this happiness to you? Happiness is a kind of contentment and inner security. It's feeling good about yourself and your relationship with the people around you. So you notice there's never the mention of an abstract idea. These are people that you see face to face. Okay, then we go to stage 4.
Well, but briefly though, just to sum up stage three
Mhm.
and tell me what you think of this, I interpret from your writings, it's a sense of, yeah, the good life and the good is the life with people in face-to-face relationships, having being part of a group, getting your sense of identity maybe from a group, and yeah, feeling maybe a part of something, but generally getting your sense of um, deep sense of value from interpersonal relationship. And the term for it that you use is altruistic mutuality. I feel like that mutual aspect is really the key aspect. It's like
Mhm.
I am a full self because I'm in community with some other group of people. But that hasn't, as you note, reached out to some kind of abstract level of seeing oneself as part of society or any kind of more abstract kind of configuration.
Yeah, so one of the things I think about is what about voting? This is problematic
Mm,
because you don't know the person that you're voting with. You don't see them face to face. So what usually happens is, because I did a smaller study on this, how you vote and everything. So you vote similar to your friends.
hmm.
It's not even about the candidate,
Yeah, yeah.
which is a little scary,
No,
but
that's fascinating. I'd love to read that study because other research I've done into politics and political affiliation definitely
mm,
supports that there's a lot, most of the kind of political activity that we see and political affiliation is around kind of group conformity and kind of, who are my sort of people rather than what's the candidate, what's their position, what are the principles. And I think
mhm.
once we kind of get a little bit disillusioned with how we think the system works and that we see it up being a lot more kind of coalitions of affiliation identities and this sort of a thing. I think actually what we see in politics, at least American politics, makes a lot more sense because that has been my experience of trying to track where political wins have shifted. Because if you try to keep track of it in terms of principles, you're like, well, wait a second, this group used to think this, and now they think this. It's like, no, 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 that's not quite so
Yeah,
how
that
that
doesn't
works.
apply.
Yeah, right.
But I do think it's important to not belittle the idea
Sure.
because being part of a group, I mean, it goes back thousands of years.
Yeah.
It's a really old idea, and um, it's probably, I mean, I'm just guessing, but probably 30-40% of the population of the US.
Hmm.
I think it's important not to trivialize it, I guess.
Sure. Yeah, yeah. Okay, so that's stage three, and then you're about to read some from
Yeah.
stage four, which stage four is called individuality, right? That's what you said?
Yeah. And it has these 5 criteria, which would take forever to read, so I'm not going to do it. So we didn't talk about this, So how the model is categorized by philosophical orientation. And that's very important. And to me, it's also fascinating because it means like these philosophers who were thinking thousands of years ago, or whatever, hundreds or long time, is exactly how we're thinking today.
Hmm.
It shows a continuity of human cognition that interests me.
Mm.
But in any case, so here we are at stage 4. So we have these different philosophical orientations, and those differentiations don't really show up much before stage 4, but they are
Mm.
present. And basically, they're all in hedonism before stage 4.
Mm.
So this is a hedonism response. I would like to have a job that I was comfortable with, that was consonant with my interests, and that I think is important and would provide for those that are close to me, but also allow me enough time to enjoy it. I'd love to run a charter boat service, the ability to explore and do new things without pressure, free to do things that might bring happiness without being tied down 9 to 5. Why is it good to be comfortable? I have no desire to live like the Rockefellers, but I do have a desire not to worry about the minimal things that make life enjoyable, like a 2-week vacation or picking up and flying to Mexico for the weekend or whatever. So this individuality is showing its head for the first time. So
Mm.
now we have an individual person who not only has an individualized way of thinking about it, but says so.
Yeah.
That's what they want. And
Hmm.
individuation is a very central part of psychological development.
Hmm.
But remember now, let's go back. Can you see, or whoever's listening, why that's a hedonistic orientation?
Well, actually, it was interesting when you're reading that. It made me think of what is it called? Ataraxia, right? Which is
Oh,
I think it's the Epicurean notion of
yeah,
like,
yeah.
it's not so much that you want, I don't know, like a lot of pleasure. It's that you don't want pain, stress. You just kind of want and
Mellow yellow.
yeah. And so anyway, so it kind of read like an Epicurean sort of approach to things, which is like,
Yeah, I
no
mean,
matter,
I'm always angry when I hear, and see Epicurus being like demoted
yeah,
because he demoted too, because he they say he was after pleasure, so pleasure seeking. He wasn't.
yeah,
He was after the absence of stress,
yeah,
absence of nervousness, the absence of fear, that you could be calm in yourself, period.
right.
And that's basically what this guy's saying. But we're going to look at another one now. So this is in so go back. The hedonistic orientation should be clear by now. So that means it's not lower or higher, it's a category across.
Hmm.
Okay, so now this is an example from the perfectionism orientation. Same stage.
Hmm.
Okay, what is a good life? First, it would be a life that has purpose and meaning built into it to generate one's own goals that were appropriate for the particular time in one's life. It would be a sense of functioning at one's fullest, of using full capacity, and be trusting of one's own values and competencies. It's very individualistic. So why would that be good? Because in this way, you feel your life has meaning, and it would have to have meaning for the society too. It seems to me that a fully functioning person benefits others as well as the self. So it's a confusion for some people who think this is a higher stage. Why? Because they like it better. But if you look at the structure, it's not different from my point of view.
Well, and there is here too, like as we were saying, this is the first stage in which society as a whole is kind of conceived of in terms of the good. So
Mhm.
it's like there's a
Mhm.
lot of what I do has to bring joy to me, but it also should be a benefit to society, which is not something that you would see
Yeah,
before this.
but just by you saying that, you can see why a lot of people think this kind of response is a higher or more complex response than the one I read earlier, right
Right.
before,
Yeah.
about a job that I feel comfortable with, but it's not. That's all
Yeah.
I can
Yeah.
say. Okay, so then we go on. So now we're at stage 5.
Well, and again, just to kind of wrap that up a little bit. So one, you
Yeah.
mentioned perfectionism, which I think is important to clarify a little bit, which is that is referring to a kind of orientation towards the good, which sees the kind of quote unquote perfectibility of man, or it's something like a like John Dewey and people who see the good as being based in how people can develop and grow and increase their potential and actualize in some kind of way, which is a different orientation to the good than the hedonistic approach. And I believe there's at least one other. Is it the eudaimonistic approach, or I'm trying to remember your languaging for it? What the different kind of categories that you put these into?
I'm looking for that. Okay. So the way I have it in terms of content is that the good is divided into two parts: hedonism and perfectionism.
Okay, so there's two. Gotcha.
Under hedonism, there's classical and social, so that's self-interest and collective interest. Under perfectionism, there's three types: functionalism, Unitarianism, and progressivism. So in perfectionism, you can do, to perfect yourself, fulfillment of function. So that's fulfillment of your skills and knowledge and so on, the potential of those.
Hmm.
Then there's Unitarianism, which is focused on nature, connection to nature, and connection to God or a godlike source. And progressivism, which is not an endpoint, but a process. The focus is on progressing towards something.
Hmm.
So these, just to be clear for the audience, I mean, these are categories of content.
Hmm.
No one is higher than another or anything like
Right.
that. And of course, they're each based on this group of philosophers. I won't
Yeah.
go into it.
So you could be a stage 4 hedonist or a stage 4 perfectionist, stage 5 hedonist, stage 5 perfectionist. Yeah.
Mhm. But at the lowest stages, 1 and 2, as I hope I've demonstrated, you don't get any perfectionism.
Right. Because presumably there's a level of abstract thought that's required to even conceive
Mm.
of that before that
Exactly.
comes online.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then to summarize stage 4, it's something it's like it's the individuation process where people are generating individually conceived of notions of the good for them. Um and but there's also an increased level of complexity for how they're conceiving of that. It's not
Well, I think it's important to note that, I mean, in simple terms, stages 1 and 2 are about the self. Then stages like 2, 3, almost a 4 are about the self and others.
Mhm.
And then from 4 on up, it's about the society.
Mm,
And it's not necessarily focusing on what makes a better society, but more uh, in the different orientations. There are different ways of thinking about it, but in each one, society is a factor. It's just almost like a math equation, Before that, it wasn't a factor. It
yeah.
wasn't even present.
Yeah. Okay.
Mhm.
Great. Well then, yeah, let's round this out with stage five then.
Okay, so at stage five, the good life is understood as a kind of a rational form of reasoning that seeks a model. And so these are people who are trying to figure out what is society anyway? What is my place in it? It's some kind of concept.
Hmm.
And I actually used a lot of interviewing in Kathmandu, Nepal. I happened to be in a position very high up in the government for reasons I don't have to go into. But I found a lot of this.
Mm,
It was really, really interesting to me how these things that we see in the West, oh, well, you have to have at least a degree or a this or that. You have to have education. They didn't have that, but they demonstrated this. So I assume it's through religious training.
mm,
But in any case, okay, so the focus of stage five is autonomy, making your own decisions, thinking for yourself, and also seeing yourself as a important piece in the collection of society.
hmm.
So this one is a perfectionism example. What is the good life? In the ideal life, everyone should have the opportunity to participate in life to the fullest. But not all people have equal capacity. This doesn't mean that any person, any social institution, or any social values should limit their development. The ideal life is for everyone to be maximizing whatever their potential is, which varies from person to person. So that's interesting. So that's for obvious reasons, the perfectionism orientation, where you're perfecting yourself or you're perfecting the society, you're moving
Hmm.
forward to better and better ends of
Hmm.
some sort. So I say, why is that good? From an abstract, universal point of view, it's part of the natural order of things. For me, the natural order of things is an evolutionary, ongoing, growing process. In the evolutionary process, the process is to maximize the development of life. I mean, we started as one cell and now we are man, and we can follow this train of thought to the development and maximization of the potential of individual lives. Man cannot select who ought to be given the opportunity. It could be arbitrary. It's man-made. So this is a model essentially of abstract principles.
Hmm.
And in this case, we're talking about progressivism. So that you could look to John Dewey for that.
Hmm.
The purpose of life for him is to develop, moving forward to greater complexity, to greater acknowledgement, greater
Yeah.
understanding, that type of thing.
Is there, maybe you have one example there, I'm not sure. I don't recall. But what would hedonism look like in a stage five setting? Because it seems harder for me to understand that at that level.
I don't have an example of it here. Immediate, right, that I can just jump on, but I do have examples of it. I have
Hmm.
two cases where the good life is really seen as fulfilling your particular potentialities. So this is where you think of Epicurus. That's actually what he was saying.
Mm,
To be calm, they're often Buddhist. The idea is developing your own mental abilities, your own emotional abilities, and finding a state of peace.
yeah. Well, so this is interesting, because this stage five is correlated with like meta-systematic cognition
Mm.
and so there's a sense of you're able to coordinate multiple systems. So what do you let me know what you think of this. I hear that as something like from a perfectionist angle. One is, in a sense, coordinating the self-actualization of the individual as one system, and keeping in mind the system of society as another system, and kind of coordinating those. But maybe a hedonistic approach to something similar might be, well, the individual is a bunch of systems, and maybe systems of relationships that relate to the individual, and you've got to coordinate all of those to achieve sort of maximal good life well-being or something. So it's still kind of
Right,
using,
but
yeah.
also, even in the hedonistic viewpoint, it's almost like hedonism gets generalized to
Mm,
the whole population.
gotcha.
So
Yeah.
that means if you're getting pleasure and or calm,
Hmm.
which is, more like it, calm, then everybody else should have it too,
Yeah.
which is more of a moral component. I don't
Yeah.
emphasize that because you can get that in the Kohlberg work.
Uh-huh. Yeah, well, maybe there's a sense of if everyone were just chill,
Right?
everything in society would be really good. So,
Uh-huh.
yeah, gotcha. And and so, okay, well, yeah, I think that so maybe to summarize then, finally, just stage five, um, you know, how would you try to put that into kind of simple language, that the person at stage five is, well, I guess you already did. You said that they're, imagining sort of the global context, and they're using a sort of model for that in a kind of abstract way to understand the good life.
I
When,
think that part of why this kind of development hasn't been well understood is because it's pretty complicated,
yeah.
particularly in the sense of these philosophical orientations.
Hmm.
Because on the face of it, the responses from different orientations can sound very different. But if you really, focus on, well, okay, let's figure this out. What are the actual social relations here?
Hmm.
Are they egoistic? Are they group? Are they larger group? Or are they societal? And
Yeah.
that pretty much can tell you what stage it is.
Yeah. And so overall, I mean, I read your model, and the findings that you present as speaking to, in a sense, the way that uh, the understanding of the good complexifies, like, because you do need increased complexity to be able to cognize multiple systems and coordinate them at stage five, versus at stage four, having a sense of your own systematic relationship to society, versus at stage three, where it's more simplistic and interpersonal, and so on and so forth. This is kind of,
Well,
do you,
I can see how you would logically go there. I don't disagree with it, but I have no evidence for that.
well, what I mean instead
Makes
is,
sense.
as you said, your stage is a kind of, is a pretty hard stage model, which works by means of hierarchical integrations.
Mhm.
So as things hierarchically integrate, they're becoming more complex. Um, and so, in a sense, you could say, or again, feel free to disagree if I'm not, but I would say that this is a complexification of the good in some way, because you're seeing increased hierarchical integrations
For
for,
sure.
yeah.
Yeah, obviously, yeah.
Okay, yeah, that was all I meant. Not necessarily
Oh,
tying it specifically to models of hierarchical complexity per se, because as you say, that hasn't
it
been done
would
as a
be
study.
sweet to
Yeah.
test that out.
And again, I'll add that to the list
Put
of
that
things.
on the list. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, actually, in some ways, Theo Dawson did a version of that, back in the early 2000s using her model. And I am working with her to see if we can get some lectical scores for some of these performances to kind of, it wouldn't be be a full-on study of all of the data, but it could at least be illuminating potentially in some way to see if this could map to.
Sounds good.
Yeah. Well, this is fascinating, fascinating stuff. Start to draw to a close a little bit here, because we're running out of time. But so that gives us a wonderful sense of the outline of this model. And again, the rigor with which you've done your studies is really impressive, and also the epistemic humility and cautiousness that you bring to, what kinds of conclusions you feel are justified to draw is also very it's a important kind of rigor, which is often lacking from some social scientific fields. So I find this,
I'm glad you feel that way.
yeah, well, for certain, yeah, for sure.
A lot of people don't.
Well, I mean, yeah,
I'm
so
not saying they don't feel that way about my
right,
work.
exactly. Yeah,
I'm just
no.
saying that they just go for broke or whatever.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and that's the thing. It's as you said, there's a lot of reasons, incentives in the academy, incentives in other areas that will lead people to want to jump to
Mhm.
conclusions that maybe aren't always entirely warranted. I do think, I mean, for my part, I do think there are meaningful connections and suggestions that can be made. And I think we just have to be careful about how we language that. We don't want to say that something is the case or that it's been shown to be the case if there isn't empirical data for it. But I think we can say it would be reasonable to assume that or something like that, at least as kind of posing hypotheses using what data we do have sometimes. But
So I just want to go back for a second,
sure.
though, and make clear that the good life questions that we just shared
Yeah.
are not anywhere near as clear or explicit in terms of developmental change than the smaller categories, such as work, person, and friendship.
Hmm.
Because good life is so broad,
Yeah. Yeah.
that people don't know exactly what to hook on to
Sure.
when they talk about it. And sometimes, well, definitely in interviewing, that question takes the longest.
Sure.
And because people just go around everywhere, and so people who are interested in this idea definitely should look into the more narrow
Yeah.
categories, which is what is good work,
Yeah.
what is good friendship, and what is a good person.
That's a good
Because
point. Yeah, because even when you do draw correlations to Commons's model in this article,
Mhm.
you specify it's good work
Mhm.
specifically, not the good life. So that's good to know. Good to know. But so thanks for that clarification. Is there anything else about your work or this model that you'd want to throw in before we start to wrap up in terms of I don't know, yeah, anything we didn't touch on or
Let's
places?
recruit people to do more studies.
Yes, yeah, amen.
That's what I want.
Yeah. For sure. Yeah, I think this is it's such interesting stuff. It's such important stuff. And
And I
that,
told you, right, about how when I first started out, I thought, who the hell is going to agree to do this? It's just so long. Because when I do this, which is all four categories,
yeah,
I also do cognitive development tests
hmm
and then Kohlberg's test.
yeah.
So it's very long.
And as we were talking about it briefly before this, you were doing all this back when you needed to transcribe from recorded tape recordings of
By
interviews.
hand.
You know, it's amazing that today we have with AI transcription things
I
and Zoom and
know.
whatever, all this
It's
work could be done.
marvelous.
It could be so much cheaper and it's really, yeah. So it's an
It's
invitation
so
for,
much
yeah.
easier.
Well, I'll tell
But
you
the
what.
but the thing I'm trying to say is that the work is worth doing.
Hmm,
I spent my life on it.
yeah. What do you, I guess maybe that would be one last question is, what are the big takeaways from this for you? Like, um, having, yeah, spent your life studying this, empirically demonstrating some very meaningful and significant patterns to how people think of the good. Um, yeah, what's the big message from this that you get around I don't know, questions that people may ask about.
Why? Yeah, I had an idea about that. I came up with a response to that already.
Oh, lovely.
So this is what bothers me. It is interesting that although ethical philosophers describe the good life for adults, there has been very little empirical interest in adult reasoning or adult morality, period. While it is adults who make social policies, establish a community's quality of life, decide to wage war, and determine methods of parenting and educating the young, there is a paucity of research on how adults actually reason about values and morality and how they might develop or change such reasoning. In a democratic society where adult citizens are expected to participate intelligently, it is particularly bewildering that interest in adults' cognitive, philosophical, and psychological capacities of this sort of intellectual practice is so lacking.
Hmm, indeed. I would agree with that completely. Um,
It really bothers me.
and I guess just some final thoughts on that from me is I think we've been in this moment for a long time where, as at the outset, as you suggested, the default mode in a lot of American culture is you ask someone, what's good, and they'll just say, it's all just, a matter of opinion. There seems to be a kind of relativism which eventually can be rather corrosive. We want to avoid, I think, kind of, you know, very top-down kind of dogmatic approaches to these things, obviously,
Well,
but
wait
that's
a
what
minute.
philosophy is for.
I don't know how you would explain this then, but I've interviewed over 300 people on this. This
Hmm.
is one study, that was longitudinal, but a lot of my students have done it and so on. Not one person, not one ever responded to the questions that, oh, it's all relative.
Hmm.
Now, how is that true?
Well, that's an interesting. I have a couple of thoughts. One is that this is the less interesting answer, which is that maybe there's some selection bias that the sort of people who would do a study would want to. They already have ideas about these sorts of things, and they're not the sort of just man on the street.
I'm
Um,
talking about teenagers at the Boys and Girls Club.
yeah.
You know, well, maybe, but maybe, yeah.
Well, so there's that possibility. The other thing is, I do also think that the it's all relative is a rather surface level answer that once you do actually start asking people deeper questions, it's very clear that there's something below that, that people do have notions of
Yeah, and maybe they don't actually use that
yeah,
principle
right.
to guide their lives.
And then I also think that a lot of that kind of relativism tends to issue forth from a very kind of academic ivory tower sort of philosophizing that's come down from sort of this postmodern um, perspective that isn't really the sort of perspective you're necessarily going to see spontaneously emerge from, normal people. It's the kind of thing
Yeah,
that have,
well, not when I was at Harvard, I can't even remember the name of the guy, but there's another well-known philosopher was in the philosophy department at that time. So I'm studying with Rawls, and he's trying to like remake the whole world. And this guy is studying the value of ice cream. Literally, literally.
uh yeah.
What does that value of ice cream mean? I'm like, are you kidding me? No, he's not kidding. So that's sort of connected to your point.
Yeah. There are modern day versions of how many angels can dance on the head of a pin questions that get explored. Um, but at the
That's
same time,
spooky.
I mean, I will say, like I find your research fascinating. I find developmental research in general fascinating and really important. But I do think that it's faced headwinds because of the kind of relativism that does seem in some ways endemic in academia and in certain institutional contexts. I hope that is changing, or will change. But I feel like I mean, even Kohlberg himself faced, headwinds around the kinds of stuff he was doing. That there's something that maybe it's in some ways unique to America and its kind of assumptions about things. I don't know that people get uncomfortable, right? When it's like, oh, what do you mean that there's a stage model for how people think about what's good? Like people want to somehow maintain, wait, no, like there is no normativity here, there is no directionality, there is no anything. It
I
makes
think
people
they're
uncomfortable.
afraid of it.
Well, I would agree with that. But I mean, but I guess my point would be the fact that those headwinds exist, it means that there is a kind of cultural pressure towards certain kinds of relativism that, interestingly, might not show up when you go to
I
talk to
think
people.
there's more pressure towards conformity than
Mm.
relative.
That's a really good point. And I think that's true. And then there's maybe an interesting way in which, at a certain point, when relativism became sort of the presumed default in academic intellectual circles, people just kind of conformed to that. And so, what we actually tend to experience is the pressure of conformity rather than any sense that people actually, put much stock in kind of relativistic frameworks, if that makes sense. But anyway,
I understand you.
yeah. Um, so, thank you very much for taking the time to do this. I hope this gives people a sense for, yeah, your work and the model that you've done. I will put some links in the description to this video for people who want to go to the source and read your actual studies on this. And we
Mhm.
also did talk about maybe doing a future conversation where we could dig in a little bit more to the philosophy, which is an important aspect, very important aspect of this that we didn't spend as much time talking about. So, if you did want to explore that in a future conversation, I'd love to get into that.
Yeah, I'd be interested in that.
Okay. But yeah, so unless there's anything else you want to throw in at this point, I just want to say thank you for this incredible work. Thank you for incredibly impressive career, being at the front lines of this kind of research. And to those who want to heed your invitation and your call, let's do more research in this vein. And
Yes,
yeah, so, but thank
it's
you very
not that hard. You can do it.
and again, it's cheaper now, so all the more
Hmm.
reason. Cheryl Armon, thank you so much. Much appreciated.
Thank you for having me.